시작을 하겠습니다. 밖에 계신 우리 저기 선생님들 안쪽으로 좀 들어와 주시기 바랍니다. 이제 인풋, 스루풋, 아웃풋으로 이렇게 볼 수가 있겠네요. 처음 시작과 과정과 결과. 근데 다 좋았는데 시작과 결과를 봤더니 그 정말 우리의 모델이었던 아일랜드가 그렇게 참 여러 가지 호의적인 분위기에서 잘 진행되던 아일랜드 시민의회가 탑다운 식으로 좀 약간 좀 전락하는 듯한 그런 모습을 보이고는 가장 최근의 경우에는 식상을 해버립니다. 아일랜드 시민들이 굉장히 우려스러운 결과를 얘기해 주셨습니다. 그러니까 우리가 주의해야 될 점, 따라야 할 점과 주의해야 될 점을 잘 말씀해 주신 것 같고요. 말씀 아까 드렸습니다만 2부에는 더 흥미로운 사례들이 준비되어 있는데요. 처음에 이제 예일대학교의 헬렌 란데모어 교수님께서 열린민주주의와 프랑스 기후시민의회에 대해서 영상으로 발표를 하시거든요. 그래서 그거를 먼저 듣고 나머지 발표자분들께서 연이어서 올라오셔서 발표를 하는 그런 순서로 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. 그러면 우선 우리 헬렌 란데모어 교수님 강의부터 들으시겠습니다.
Hello, my name is Hélène Landemore. I'm a professor of political science at Yale University, and I'm delighted to be included in this symposium on citizens' assemblies. I want to thank Professor S.J. Kim and Wright King Lee in particular for the invitation. I want to also take advantage of this little video to say hi to my colleagues and friends, Min Rochon and David Farrell, who I know are with you today. So I'm here to vicariously, and I very much regret it, to tell you a little bit about my book, Open Democracy, which I understand has just come out in Korean, which I'm extremely proud and grateful for. And to tell you a little bit about the French Citizens' Assemblies in particular, which are a case study in the book as well. So let me introduce the book. The book itself, so Open Democracy, Reinventing Popular Rule for the 21st Century, is a book that I wrote as a sequel, in fact, to my first book called Democratic Reason. And the first book was a very theoretical analysis of the concept and ideal of democracy. And I'd come to conclude that if we care about what I call the epistemic properties of democracy, namely their ability to aggregate knowledge and produce good results, we should probably select our representatives by lot rather than through elections. And that was a startling finding, if you will, which ran against my own upbringing and the sort of unquestioned faith I had in liberal democracy as the end of history and the best regime ever invented by mankind. And the more I was probing this idea that maybe if we care about the epistemic properties of democracy, we should then try to change the way we select our leaders and our representatives, the more I felt like I had to develop an actual vision for what a democracy centering randomly selected representatives would look like. So that's what this book, Open Democracy, Reinventing Popular Rule for the 21st Century, is about. So in the book, I don't defend the view that we would be better off with randomly selected representatives. That's something I did in the previous book. Roughly, just so you get the gist of the argument in the previous book, the idea is that you don't really get collective wisdom unless you include all the perspectives that are relevant to a given problem. And in politics, because there are so many problems and they're so unpredictable, you cannot really afford, in fact, to reserve the decision-making process to a biased sample of select people, no matter how smart they are, you should probably try to keep your system as inclusive and receptive to ideas that are out there as possible. And so that's why the idea would be to rotate representatives in and out of power on the basis of random selection, rather than through elections who have a more homogenizing effect. Okay, so as you can tell, the book Open Democracy starts from a certain disillusionment with respect to so-called representative democracy as we know it, as much as from this theoretical conclusion I had reached in the previous book. Because the reality is that if you look at our so-called representative democracies, our modern liberal democracies, the role that citizens have in them is very, very limited, and I'm quite sure it's as true in Korea as it is in France or in the US. What is our role as ordinary citizens in modern representative democracies? It is mostly that of being ruled by a professional elected elite that we get to choose every 4 or 5 years, and that we get to consent to, supposedly, at the ballot booth. But we never really get to rule ourselves, right? So in practice, that means that our understanding of what makes for good governance and good government, it's this Platonician idea that in order to get good governance, you need to put the best and the brightest in a position of power. When in fact, as I said, my own research, inspired by social science results and political theory arguments, is that if you want good results in politics for a large and diverse group of people, you're probably better off rotating a random sample in the position of decision making. And that, to me, is a hypothesis that makes sense of the fact that in practice, people don't seem to be very happy with current governance schemes that are based on election. If you look around, there seems to be a chronic state of crisis across the West and beyond in so-called electoral democracies. The sort of acute crisis we've seen are, for example, the Brexit vote in the UK. Whether you think the decision was right or not, it was clearly a moment of sort of a crisis and an expression of discontent at the sort of neoliberal policies put in place by the European Union. You can see it, the discontent as well in France, in the Yellow Vest movement that started in November 2018. You may have heard of these people who protested a fuel tax decided by President Macron and started gathering on roundabouts and on highways and later on the Champs-Élysées, breaking things and putting on this yellow jacket that we all have to have in our cars in France in case of roadside emergencies. And very symbolically, this yellow jacket is also an expression of the desire that these people want to be seen. They want to be heard and seen in a way that they don't feel that they are seen in the current system. In the US, you also had all kinds of protests around Black Lives Matters, and the Trump vote is also often described as a form of protest vote against Washington's sort of elite that is disconnected from regular folks. In Chile, there was a constitutional change after massive protests triggered by a rise in the metro ticket price, I believe. So we see that people are not really happy, they're not really getting what they want. And we also have a wealth of empirical evidence at this point that policies in electoral democracies tend to be overly responsive to the preferences of the richer part of society, whether richer individuals or business interest groups. in a way that leaves out of the social pact, if you will, the bottom classes and the lesser wealthy part of the population. So there is some reason to worry about the lack of responsiveness of the current. Unequal distribution of political office is that ruling elites end up having conflicts of interest, certainly, because they become a separate class of their own, but also enormous blind spots. That means that even when they have the best intentions in the world, they cannot quite figure out the solutions that are needed for the country. So I borrow this intuition again from a number of authors, including the sophists, Aristotle, but more recently somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois, the civil rights activist, historian, sociologist, and political theorist, who wrote in a book called Darkwater, specifically in an essay called On the Ruling of Men, the following. He writes, I quote, "In the people, we have the source of that endless life and unbounded wisdom which the rulers of men must have." And he says, unquote, and he says that's the real argument for democracy. And I think there's a great deal of insight in that view. It's basically saying that you're not going to be able to get the information and the knowledge and the definition of values you need if you don't consult widely the entire population without excluding anyone. And if you exclude people, whether it's the yellow vests or black populations or poor minorities or any group really, you're going to lose in wisdom, and it's going to come back to haunt you because people will not be happy with the results and you will have to deal with constant instability. So what can be done instead? What can we envision instead? So I'm a political theorist, so what I'm going to give you is not a turnkey solution or a constitution ready to be implemented. It's a vision for something else, something that I call open democracy, and which for me is meant to be a more authentic instantiation of rule by the people. I should say though that when I say rule by the people, I do not mean direct rule. I do not mean direct democracy and mass referenda all the time. I think mass referendums are important, but they don't have to take place on every single issue. But what I mean by rule by the people is that in my model, everyone has an equal chance of accessing the center of power, which for me is the legislative power. So open democracy is best defined as a new paradigm of democracy that takes seriously the ideal of popular rule as ruled by the people and recovers the openness of earlier democratic practices, including especially practices that we are familiar with from ancient Greece. Let me now define the constitutional institutional principles of open democracy. There are 5 of them. The first one is participation rights. The second one is deliberation. The third one is the majoritarian principle. The fourth one is democratic representation. And the fifth one is transparency. So I'm going to say a few words about each of them in turn. Single mother preferences or reasonable procedure, pose them in the next round of the debate. Of democratic legislative, we card for elected officials every 4 or 5 years. They're more than just the rights of association, freedom of religion, and other liberal rights, you might call them, that allow us to pursue, all kinds of ideas and actions in the public sphere, in a free society. They are all powers, in fact, powers of initiating laws and powers of recalling them. So, for example, I put forward this citizens' initiative as something that should be constitutionalized in an authentic democracy. A citizens' initiative is the right that citizens have to put something on the legislative agenda of parliament if they manage to gather enough signatures among the rest of the population. A right of referral is the possibility, the right for citizens to recall an existing law or policy if they don't like it, if they manage to gather enough signatures and trigger a referendum on the relevant law or policy. A citizens' initiative referendum is also part of these participation rights. It allows citizens to send a law proposal directly to a referendum, again when they've hit a minimal threshold of signatures. The second principle, deliberation, is basically the exchange of views and arguments among equals that forms the heart of an attractive theory of democratic legitimacy developed in the 1990s by authors like Jürgen Habermas, Josh Cohen, or John Rawls. Those authors thought that it's just not enough that we get to vote for elected leaders or that we aggregate judgments for the policies and laws that result to be legitimate. What we want is to have those laws and policies debated by the entire community, or if not the entire community, at least their democratic representatives. Because the thought is that we are odd reasons for why the state decides to tax us a certain way, or to make certain investments, or forbid certain industries or behaviors. We are odd reasons so that we can contest them, so that we can oppose them in the next round of the debate. For me, deliberation is a technology we have yet to fully master. We don't fully know the place of the things like rhetoric and emotion in it, but it's a very attractive part of a functional and desirable democracy. The third principle is the majoritarian principle. It seems obvious to me, it should be obvious to most of you, I suppose, that when we disagree, we then go by the preferences of the majority, at least as a default rule, in an authentic democracy. It's because this majoritarian principle expresses respect for each of us, but also because when we aggregate views on issues that lend themselves to an epistemic reading, we are more likely to get to, in my view, the right answer. So it's a perfectly reasonable procedure in a democracy for at least those two reasons. Yet somehow, in many existing democracies, this majoritarian principle has been curbed to the point that some authors, like my colleagues at Harvard, Ziblatt and Levitsky, now think that the US has become governed by minority rule, right? Because there are so many ways to curb majority rule through the courts, through the bicameral systems, through the filibuster, through all kinds of tricks and procedures that, in fact, we rob the majority of the satisfaction of its preferences, for example, on, say, gun regulation or other topics like corporate taxation on a daily basis. So reinstating some amount of majoritarian rules seems to me very important. The fourth principle is democratic representation. When we deliberate, we don't necessarily, we cannot necessarily do it all together at once, especially in large countries. So we do want at least that function of agenda setting and definition of options to be conducted among representatives. And the question is, okay, but who should be the representatives? We've assumed since the 18th century that we should choose those representatives on the basis of election. I propose that we choose them also, at the very least, through civic lotteries, by lot, on the principle of one person, one lottery ticket. It's to me the best way, the cheapest way as well, to bring in the center, to the center of power, enough of the diversity of views and life experiences that are needed to generate good decisions. If you're not going to have, single mothers and students and retired people and artisans and yellow vest types in the room where decisions are made, you're very likely to miss out on key elements of the solutions you're offering to their problems. And so that's why I'm a fan of this mode of representation. The kind of bodies that I'm thinking of when I say representation by lot are citizens' assemblies. They're one type of so-called mini-publics, which are any type of body that's based on random selection. The specificity of citizens' assemblies is that they tend to be large, between 75 and maybe 250 people. They tend to be organized on the relatively long term, several days, several weeks, several months, and they're gathered to generate policy recommendations, and even, in the case at least of the French Citizens' Convention on Climate, law proposals. So the last principle that comes as a complement, as a sort of accountability mechanism to make the whole vision somewhat trustworthy, is transparency. I mean, there are other accountability mechanisms that we want to think about, but I do think that for sortition-based assemblies, for example, since we don't have elections, transparency would seem to be a big deal. Transparency guarantees that the larger public, which is not involved in the deliberations of the smaller mini-public, the citizens' assemblies, keep an eye on what's being said and deliberated and possibly decided on their behalf. Now, these are the 5 structuring principles of my vision of open democracy. The question is, does this add up to something that is even remotely feasible? Here there are 2 possible reactions. Some of you may think that, well, everything you described so far is completely aligned with what we believe in and to some extent should already have. The other reaction might be, well, this is too idealistic and unfeasible. So to the first category of viewers, I'd say it's not quite as similar to what we already have as you think, in particular because nothing in my model requires that we keep or have elected assemblies. I think that you could have a hybrid system with a form of bicameralism where you'd have an elected chamber in charge of doing some of the job it's currently doing, but you would also have a randomly selected chamber that is empowered with the task of doing things that, for example, current elected assemblies do poorly, like reforming electoral law, where there's conflict of interest between elected officials and the task of reforming the way they are elected, or perhaps environmental law, because elected officials have a tendency to focus on the short term, what's going to benefit them at the next round of elections, whereas we do want to have bodies that focus on the long term and do not worry about the short term of electoral re-election. But you could have also a purely lotocratic model where the heart of the democracy, the legislative power, is entirely in the hands of a citizens' assembly, the way it was in a way in ancient Greece, where the Council of 500, the Boule, had an enormous power of agenda setting, and later, in the 4th century, much of the legislative power of the large open assembly, to which anybody could join, was transferred to randomly selected bodies, the so-called nomothetai, that were in charge of actually creating the law. Okay, so but still there is this question, okay, whether we're going for a radical version or a more hybrid version of open democracy, is it still doable? Like, are citizens even remotely capable of writing the law, for example? Well, so here I'm going to talk about the two case studies that form the heart of the book, which is actually quite empirical. I know this doesn't sound like it from what I've said so far, but there are key chapters in there that focus entirely on case studies. So the first one is about Iceland and the constitutional process that took place there in 2010, 2013. So Iceland is a very small country. It's about the size of a city in the US, about 320,000 citizens, but it did something that no country has had the courage to really try before in a way. It's to involve the citizens in the writing of the social contract. And I found this, other countries had tried before to, there's a wave of participatory constitution making since the 1980s. That has tried to involve people in the ratification moment and sometimes upstream of the process in the input to the work of the drafters. But I do think Iceland has been quite unique in the way it's tried to include the public in the actual writing of the document. So to me, this example shows that ordinary citizens are actually capable of writing the basic social contract of a country, such that when we say we the people, in the preamble of constitutions, it can actually mean we the people, or at least people, if it's not all the people in the writing stage, people that look like us and could have been us. So what Iceland did is that in 2010, just after their economy imploded, after the 2008 crisis, they decided that they wanted to rewrite their constitution in an inclusive manner. So they first convened a sample of 950 randomly selected citizens and had them brainstorm about the values that they wanted to see in their constitution. And then they transferred the resulting document to a group of 25 elected officials, elected ordinary citizens that were chosen from a pool that had excluded all the professional politicians, actually. Anyone in power at the time was excluded from that pool. So you ended up with a group of much more ordinary citizens than you would have had normally for the writing of a constitution. And what these 25 people did is write their proposal, but not in a secretive manner behind closed doors, like, for example, the framers did it in the case of the American constitutions. They did it publicly, transparently, openly, and they even invited the outside public to contribute. So they put their draft online 12 times over and asked for feedback, integrated the feedback, and at the end delivered a product of absolutely remarkable quality that I've studied in detail, that I describe in the book, and they put it to a referendum, which approved the document with 2/3 of the vote. Unfortunately, that referendum was purely advisory, so the parliament then chose to ignore the result of that vote, and to this day, the Icelandic constitution hasn't changed. But the fact is that for me, whatever the actual success or failure of the process, and it is still a case of very courageous and visionary constitution making that tried to be as inclusive and open as ever been done, and I think it should be an inspiration to other countries. Now, as I was writing the sort of concluding words to my book at the time, based on that one single case study of Iceland, it turns out that my country decided to try something really bold, a citizens' convention of ordinary citizens on the issue of climate change. So I had to postpone the publication basically to look at that case study in detail. I actually flew to France over the course of a year many times to study this brand new object in the French context and include it as a shadow case in the book as well. So let me tell you a little bit about the French Citizens' Convention on Climate. As I evoked before, Macron's fuel tax of 2008 caused an enormous amount of resistance and social protests, and inspired by the precedent of Irish citizens' assemblies, which had been conducted on marriage equality and abortion a few years prior, he decided, okay, I'm also going to try this deliberative method. It seems interesting and likely to quiet down the country a little bit. So I'm going to convene 150 randomly selected citizens in the Iéna Palace, the seat of our third legislative chamber in France, which is right next to the Eiffel Tower, and ask them to solve the problem I couldn't solve with my fuel tax. So he asked them the following question. Quote, how to reduce France's greenhouse gas emissions by 40% of their 1990s levels by 2030 in a spirit of social justice. So these 150 randomly selected citizens were convened between October 2019 and June 2020 for 7 meetings that were each 2.5 days long, usually taking place on a weekend, where they had to learn a lot about, climate change, its origins, its solutions, what can be done at the level of the French nation, all the way down to the exact contribution of the housing sector and the traveling sector and the production sector and the consumption sector to this particular share of greenhouse gas emissions in the French economy. I have to confess that when I heard about this convention, my first thought was like, oh my God, this might not work out. This is a very technical topic, and usually citizens' assemblies are convened on slightly less technical issues that have more of a moral and value component. And I thought, if this fails, this is going to be the end of citizens' assemblies in France. But it succeeded not quite as brilliantly as one could have hoped, but it succeeded sufficiently that, in fact, President Macron decided to do another one 2 years later. So let me tell you a bit more about that convention. So the 150 people were a relatively descriptive sample of the larger population. There were 50% women. You had people from the overseas territories represented in the convention as well. You didn't have that many climato-skeptic. It's true that was probably an underrepresented category, but you had an amazing diversity of profiles present there. You had roofers, you had nurses, you had people selling heating systems. So an amazing richness of perspective. You had pilots, engineers, all kinds of perspectives. You had young people, older people, and they gathered in small groups to offer solutions to various sub-questions, until eventually they submitted a 500-page report containing 149 proposals to the president. Interestingly, none of these 149 proposals included a carbon tax, which is ironic, because in a way I think President Macron might have convened this convention in the hope that they would learn that a carbon tax is actually a good solution, right? That it's an important tool in the toolbox of solving climate change. But they didn't, and they were very creative. The content of the proposition itself was not necessarily completely creative. In a way, they learned from experts and they used the solution that they learned from them, but the way they repackaged them into a coherent set of policies and proposals was quite unique. So to me, I could go into details about how all of this went, but I think I'm trying to save some suspense for those of you who may want to read the book. What I get from that first relatively successful experience of the climate convention is that it proved that citizens of a large multicultural country like France can actually write the law on a complex question like climate change. This is actually quite a landmark, if you ask me, because a lot of the skepticism towards citizens' assemblies so far had been that, well, it's all very nice, but Ireland is a small country, it's 5 million people, it's very homogeneous, white and Christian. Iceland is even worse, it's so small and homogeneous. France is a 67 million people country. We have large minorities. We are closer to, in a way, the US in that sense. And so the fact that citizens are capable of coming to a consensus on conflicting issues like climate change and climate justice is quite reassuring. So I just want to end on an invitation, of course, to read my book. I think you'll find in it provocative ideas and a great deal of evidence for why involving citizens in policy and lawmaking is a good idea. And again, I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you in Seoul. This sounds like a really fun event and a fun party, but I trust there will be other occasions. And please, if you want to get in touch, I'm sure the organizers can share my email, and I look forward to hearing how the event went. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
네, 감사합니다. 지금 랑데모 교수의 이 발표를 영상으로 들으셨고요. 이제 다른 분들은 다 여기 와 계십니다. 벨기에와 이제 한국 사례인데요. 다 여기 포디움으로 올라와 주시면 좋겠습니다. 프로페서 루샹. 이 다수결제와 뭐였죠? 마지막에 투명성, 이걸 가지고 원칙으로 이제 새로운 오픈 디모크라시 얘기하는데 가장 좋은 예는 시티즌 어셈블리다. 그 예를 두 개를 들어주겠다. 아이슬랜드, 그건 조그만 사례죠. 우리 김상주 교수님 얘기하셨는데 프렌치를 말하기 큰 나라에서도 이게 가능하다. 여기에 대한 문제점이라든지 제도의 구체적인 면은 조금 설명이 적었습니다만 기본 원칙과 프랑스라는 새로운 사례에 대해서 우리가 배울 수 있었던 것 같습니다. 이제 여기 계신 우리 전문가들께서 다음번 이제 국가 사례에 대한 이제 발표가 있으시겠는데요. 첫 번째가